He was barely more than a boy when he first put on the black Panzer wrap, its wool still stiff and unfamiliar on his shoulders, the death's head insignia staring back at him with an authority he didn't yet feel he possessed. Like so many young recruits pulled into the Panzerwaffe during the later years of the war, his journey began not with confidence but with a crash course meant to turn boys into crewmen in a fraction of the time it had taken earlier generations. He learned the basics: how to load the KWK cannon without smashing his fingers, how to coordinate with the driver in the cramped confines of the turret, how to respond when the tank commander barked an order he couldn't hear over the engine's roar. Everything smelled of fuel, hot metal, and oil, and the instructors liked to remind them that if they could still smell any of it during combat, they were probably already in danger. Training grounds, once bustling with veteran crews passing on their experience, now felt hollow. Many of those veterans were gone, killed, captured, or tied to fronts that seemed to be collapsing all at once. In their place stood exhausted non-commissioned officers who had cycled through too many battles and too many replacements. They taught with a sense of urgency rather than patience, aware that for most of these young men, their first real combat would also be a harsh awakening. The tank he trained with was unreliable, patched together from salvaged parts, but it was still more machine than any of the recruits had ever handled. He grew familiar with the clang of the hatch closing above him, the claustrophobia of the turret, the way his heartbeat always quickened when the engine coughed to life. Yet even in the middle of that accelerated learning curve, there were moments when the camaraderie of the crew made the tank feel less like a metal coffin and more like a small, stubborn world unto itself. The loader he was paired with shared stories from home. The driver, older by a few years, tried to act like an older brother to everyone, and the commander, a man who had survived long enough to earn a scar across his jaw, offered advice that sounded pessimistic but was grounded in hard reality. He drilled into them the importance of communication, short, clear commands, no wasted movements, never losing track of where everyone was inside the machine. Chaos, he told them, killed tankers faster than enemy shells. Despite the authoritative tone, there was no masking the truth they all understood: the Panzerwaffe they were entering was not the same force that had once stormed across Europe. Supplies were limited, fuel was scarce, and the Allies held both the air and the momentum. Still, for a young man raised on stories of armored might and decisive battles, stepping into a tank for the first time still carried a certain weight. It felt significant, historic even, as though he had joined something larger than himself. But beneath that fleeting sense of pride was an unspoken fear, one that lingered in the quiet moments before lights out in the barracks, that he might never make it home once the training ended and the real war began. When the orders finally came down, there was no dramatic send-off, no stirring speeches, just the clatter of boots on frozen ground and the dull, mechanical rumble of vehicles preparing to move out. He and his crew were assigned to a Panzer unit that had been pulled back only long enough to patch up what could still move and fill the ranks with replacements who barely knew the smell of cordite. The front was waiting, and there was no time to ease into it. As the column rolled forward, he felt the first real weight of what lay ahead, a heaviness that settled somewhere between his ribs as the engine vibrated through the hull beneath him. Training had been one thing, this was something entirely different. The landscape they were pushing toward was scarred and colorless, littered with the skeletal remains of vehicles that had once looked just like theirs. Some were burned out, some half buried in mud or snow, all of them silent reminders of how quickly a tank could turn from a weapon to a tomb. The old driver beside him tried to keep the atmosphere light, tapping rhythms on the controls and cracking jokes that didn't quite land, but even he couldn't disguise the tension tightening around the crew as they drew closer to their first contact. Reports filtered through the radios: enemy armor spotted ahead, infantry dug in, artillery ranging the open fields. Every message was clipped, rushed, and underscored by the unmistakable stress of men under pressure. He noticed immediately how different the real front sounded compared to the training grounds. Out here, the noise didn't come in neat, predictable bursts. It arrived in layers: distant explosions, the chopping thunder of aircraft overhead, the rattling crack of machine gun fire drifting on the wind. The moment the tank commander ordered hatches down, the world shrank to a cramped, dimly lit shell of steel and sweat. Every bump in the terrain jolted the crew. Every radio transmission felt like a warning wrapped in static. And every new position they maneuvered into brought the possibility of an ambush. It wasn't long before the first mechanical problems surfaced. The engine sputtered when pushed too hard, and one of the road wheels groaned in a way that worried even the more experienced crew members. But there was no stopping. The unit was stretched thin, its tank spread out to cover ground that once would have been held by twice as many vehicles. They had to keep moving, keep probing, keep responding to calls for support. At one point an officer on the radio demanded immediate assistance for a flank that was collapsing under artillery fire. Their tank turned toward the sound of distant detonations, and he felt the turret shift as if the machine itself hesitated. What struck him most, more than the noise, more than the fear, was the intensity of the confusion. Smoke billowed from unseen sources, vehicles appeared and vanished between trees and ridgelines, and orders changed as quickly as they arrived. It became clear that no one had a perfect picture of what was happening. They were part of a vast, chaotic struggle where visibility was limited, communication imperfect, and survival depended on instincts sharpened by experience he simply didn't have yet. As they advanced deeper into the contested ground, he realized that whatever expectations he had carried from training had already fallen away. This was the war he had been thrown into, and it was far more unforgiving than he had imagined. The attack began before dawn, when the sky was still a dull, bruised gray and the cold hung in the air like a warning. Their tank was positioned near the front of the formation, not because they were experienced, but because the unit had no other choice. Too many veteran crews were gone, and the replacements had to fill the gaps wherever they appeared. He felt the familiar thrum of the engine beneath him as the tank lurched forward, treads biting into the frost-hardened earth. Inside the turret, breaths were short and clipped, the silence broken only by the commander's voice relaying orders he seemed to be assembling on the fly. The moment they crested the first rise, the world erupted. Enemy shells thundered into the ground around them, kicking up geysers of dirt and smoke. It took him a moment to understand what was happening. This wasn't just incoming fire, it was a prepared position, waiting for them. The commander shouted corrections to the driver, trying to weave the tank through the kill zone, but each impact felt closer than the last. When he swung the turret toward the flashes on the horizon, his hands trembled just enough to make the sights jitter. He told himself to breathe, to focus, to remember the drills, but no training had ever replicated this chaos. They spotted the first enemy tank moments later, a dark silhouette breaking through the haze of smoke. The commander barked the order to fire, and he slammed the round into the breech, the metal biting at his palms. The recoil rocked the entire vehicle, the shell streaking across the field, but they couldn't see if it struck home. Another enemy vehicle emerged from the flank, and suddenly the radio was flooded with overlapping voices, warnings, pleas for assistance, frantic calls for smoke screens and artillery support that wasn't coming. It was impossible to tell who was still fighting and who was already gone. Then came the hit. Not a penetrating shot, but a glancing blow that sent a metallic shriek through the hull and knocked the breath out of him. Lights flickered. The driver cursed. The tank shuddered forward sluggishly, something grinding beneath them in a way that promised trouble. He scrambled to load another round, his hands moving on instinct, while the commander tried to regain their bearings. The second hit was worse. It slammed into the side with a violence that made his ears ring and the interior burst into momentary darkness. The smell of burning insulation filled the turret. Someone yelled, he couldn't tell who. The commander ordered them to bail out, but the hatch above him jammed halfway. Smoke poured in, thick and choking. The driver tried to force his way up from below, only to collapse back into the hull. The tank jerked again, suddenly listing to one side as if kneeling. Outside, through the narrow vision slit, he could see only flashes of light and the warped shadows of men scrambling across the battlefield. The world narrowed to the confined, suffocating heat inside the turret, each breath harder than the last. What happened in the final seconds was witnessed by no one who survived. The unit reported the tank lost in the confusion, listed with several others that vanished when the line buckled. Whether it burned, rolled into a shell crater, or was finished off by another volley, no one could say with certainty. All they knew was that it never returned, and neither did the young man who had gone into his first battle with fear in his chest and hope still lingering somewhere inside him, extinguished in the smoke and chaos of that morning.